In the wide stretch of Willow Creek, Texas, in the restless spring of 1885, a wealthy widowed cattleman found himself staring down the raw edges of fatherhood. He needed a nanny, not out of convenience, but survival. The woman who answered the need was not a stranger, but his late wife's sister. Inside the grand, weather-worn house perched on the edge of the prairie, the air was thick with exhaustion. The baby was crying again. For hours, Graham Lorne had paced the creaking parlor floor, boots groaning under his weight. In his arms, baby Thomas twisted and shrieked, tiny fists clenched, mouth wide with grief that he didn't understand but felt deeply. Graham rocked him, first gently, then more desperately, then softly again, his shirt damp with sweat, his voice rough and breaking. "Easy, boy," he whispered, barely holding the crack in his throat. "It's just me, just Pa." But the wails only grew louder, sharp and endless, echoing to the hollow rooms like thunder after lightning. He finally sank into the rocker by the cold hearth, his hands trembling. "He doesn't want me," he said into the dimness, his words thin and brittle. "He wants her, her hands, her voice." His own hands, broad and callous from splitting fence posts, taming wild horses, and, only 6 weeks before, digging the grave of his wife, were not made for gentleness. Marjorie had passed at the first thaw, and with her had gone every soft edge in the house. Now it was just him, the boy, and the ache that lived between every cry. By noon the next day, with the wind tugging at his coat sleeves, Graham stood at the gate, carving words into a cedar board with blackened nail and the same slow, steady force he used to brand cattle. And he wanted, he wrote, crooked and rough. He nailed it to the fence post where the dirt road forked east toward Willow Creek and beyond. Then he went back inside and waited, bottle untouched on the table, baby resting on his chest like a question he couldn't answer. 3 days passed. Then the creak of wagon wheels broke the quiet. Graham looked up from the porch as a stagecoach rattled in from the horizon. The driver dismounted, opened the back, and helped a solitary woman step down. She carried only a satchel and a bonnet folded in her hand. Her dress was plain, mended at the elbows, her shoes coated in the dust of miles. She paused to read the sign on the gate, then lifted her gaze to him. Graham rose, brushing hay from his pants. "You came from town," he called. She nodded, her voice even and calm. "From Clifton first, then the last coach to Willow Creek." "You saw the sign?" he asked. "I did." "Come on up," he said simply. "Boys inside." She stepped onto the porch, each movement careful and deliberate. Up close he saw her face, tired but unshaken, warm but steady. Her eyes carried something old, something searching. "You looking for work?" he asked. "Yes. I can cook, clean, care for children." He stared a moment longer, then pushed open the door behind him. "Then God help us both." As Thomas's cries began again, she was already moving. "I can try," she said, and reached for the baby. The way she held him, as if she'd done it 100 times, nearly brought Graham to his knees. The child quieted at once. Graham blinked in disbelief. "What's his name?" she asked, eyes on the boy. "Thomas," he said quietly. "Thomas Lorne." She nodded. "He's a beautiful child." He cleared his throat. "And you, what do I call you?" There was a pause. "Lena," she said. "Lena Marlowe." Graham frowned faintly at the name, but said nothing. Outside, the stagecoach rolled away in a cloud of dust. Inside, the crying stopped, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like the house could breathe. Life settled into rhythm. Lena rose with the pale light, soothing Thomas before the rooster stirred. She moved through the house like a thread holding it together. Quiet, constant, essential. Her steps were light, her voice softer than cotton. Slowly, the heavy silence inside the walls began to change. Graham noticed. He would pass by the kitchen and linger, without meaning to, drawn by the sound of her lullabies. He didn't speak much, hadn't since Marjorie died, but his eyes began to follow her, not with suspicion but something quieter, something he hadn't named. She never caught him watching directly, but sometimes when she turned from the stove or looked up from the cradle, he would already be glancing away, pretending to check the hinges or stack wood. One morning, She found her shawl folded neatly on the banister, washed, warmed by the hearth. She had forgotten it outside the night before. She said nothing, only glanced at Graham's broad shoulders as he saddled his horse and wondered. Another time, she sat on the porch swing nursing Thomas under the midday sun. When she reached for her tin of water, a fresh pitcher waited beside her, cool with mint leaves floating in it. She stared, then took a slow sip, letting the silence speak what he never could. One stormy night, as wind pushed against the windows like restless spirits, Lena coughed, a hard, rasping sound. She tried to hide it beneath her blanket, unwilling to wake the house. By the time dawn slipped over the horizon in a veil of pale gray, her throat felt scraped raw, every breath catching against the chill of the night. She moved through the dim hallway, eyes heavy from sleeplessness, and made her way to the kitchen with slow, careful steps. There, beside the kettle, a small glass jar waited, its contents thick and golden, the light catching the honey like liquid amber. Leaning against it was a folded scrap of paper, its edges worn and the handwriting across it slanted, neat and unfamiliar. For the throat, it read. Glenna stood still, staring at the note as if afraid it might vanish. Her fingers hovered over the paper, brushing the ink lightly, then trailed to the edge of the jar, warm from the morning sun. She said nothing when Graham passed through the kitchen later, his boots quiet on the planks, his gaze unreadable. But when she looked up from where she stood, her eyes were softer. That afternoon, she boiled water with ginger, added a spoonful of the honey, and drank it slowly, the heat soothing her chest as Thomas slept in the cradle beside her. When she returned to her room that evening, the jar was gone, but the note remained tucked carefully between the worn pages of her Bible. At the Lauren Ranch, time passed in slow, muted hours, each day draped in repetition and silence, painted in soft cries and quiet chores. Lena moved through the house like a spirit with purpose, rising before the rooster, feeding Thomas, washing linens by hand, warming milk on the stove with a patience that asked for nothing in return. She never waited for thanks, and Graham never gave one, though his presence lingered at the edges, arms folded, boots braced, eyes shadowed not just with weariness but with the heaviness of memory. He spoke in nods, in brief glances, his grief making him cautious, wordless. Yet he noticed when Thomas began to coo instead of cry, when the boy fell asleep without being rocked, when the weight of the house began to shift. And Lena noticed him noticing. One evening, after Thomas had gone still upstairs, the hush of the prairie wind brushing dry grass against the window panes, Lena found herself at the end of the hall, standing before a door she had passed many times but never opened. It was always closed, the brass handle left untouched, the silence behind it respected, like sacred ground. But something in her moved now, pulling her hand forward. She turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was still and dim, the scent of lavender and cotton hanging in the air like breath held too long. This had been Marjorie's room. The curtains hung heavy, letting only slivers of moonlight slice across the floor. A shawl lay neatly folded on the bed, untouched, the corners slightly frayed. The wallpaper curled in places where time had pressed too hard. Lena moved gently, reverently, toward the table by the window, where a comb and a brush rested beside a chipped vase holding a single dried flower. A wooden jewelry box sat there, its lid slightly ajar. Inside, nestled between pieces of cloth, lay a strip of hand-woven fabric. Frayed, faded, the pink and blue threads dulled by years. A bracelet, no larger than a child's wrist. Her breath caught. She reached out with trembling fingers and lifted it into her palm. There, stitched faintly in the corner, was a name. Lena. She stumbled back a step, clutching it to her chest. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, stunned. It couldn't be. It simply couldn't. But it was. She remembered it. The way Marjorie had made it from scraps of cloth and stolen threads, how she tied it on Lena's wrist in the dark orphanage hallway, whispering, "So you don't forget." They had been separated not long after that. Torn apart by foster homes and forgotten promises, like laundry pinned between distant fences. Lena had searched for her, year after year, holding tight to fading memories and dreams that always ended in cold silence. And now, here she was, living under her sister's roof, holding her sister's child. Her gaze drifted to the desk along the wall, where a small charcoal sketch stood in a dark wooden frame. The woman in it smiled gently, her features older but unmistakable. Marjorie. Tears welled up and spilled over. Lena curled around the bracelet on the floor, her shoulders trembling with the weight of it all. This wasn't just a job. It hadn't been for some time. This was something more, something deeper. Not chance, not coincidence. Fate. Marjorie, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I found you too late. But not too late for Thomas. Not for the boy sleeping upstairs who carried her sister's eyes. She rose slowly, wiped her tears with the edge of her apron, and gently placed the bracelet back into the box. No longer a relic, now a vow. Downstairs, Graham was stacking firewood near the hearth. He looked up when she entered the room, but said nothing. She managed a quiet smile and turned toward the stove. Would Mr. Lorne care for some coffee? She asked. He paused, studied her face for a moment, then nodded once. That night, she lay awake in the narrow bed beside the nursery, listening to Thomas's soft, even breathing. The moonlight fell across the room in crooked patches. She did not sleep. She simply watched the silver light on the floor and held her breath. She would not tell Graham, not yet, not until she could find the words. But she would stay, and she would love that boy with every part of herself that remembered what it meant to be a sister. The house had settled into its quiet, that rare hush that came only after Thomas, restless and fevered from teething, had finally drifted into sleep in Lena's arms. Her voice had been the only thing to calm him, a soft rhythm rising and falling like a tide too gentle to crash. Outside the nursery, Graham lingered in the hallway, the low glow of the lantern behind him casting his shadow long and slanted across the worn wooden planks. He had been on his way to the kitchen for water, but the sound of her voice stopped him, a whisper not meant to be heard, weaving through the barely open door like wind slipping through an old curtain. I had a sister once, Lena murmured, cradling Thomas against her chest, his breath warm to the fabric of her blouse. She made me a bracelet when we were little, out of scraps of old cloth. She stitched my name in crooked thread, Lena. Her voice trembled at the edge of memory. She was brave, always trying to protect me. But they took us, split us apart. I never saw her again. Graham's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but he couldn't pull himself away. Something about her words rooted him. She used to say my name like it meant something, Lena continued, her voice almost a lullaby now, the rhythm of the rocker creaking beneath her. I kept that bracelet until the cloth wore through. I looked for her in every place I went, but I never knew where she ended up. Sometimes I wonder if she ever thought of me. Thomas exhaled softly, his tiny hand still grasping a fold of her sleeve, and then Lena fell silent, save for the gentle creak of wood and the soft crackle of firelight from downstairs. Graham backed away quietly, each step burdened with thoughts he hadn't known he still carried. In the solitude of his study, he opened the old roll-top desk, its hinges stiff with disuse. From a bottom drawer, he drew out a folded letter, untouched since the day Marjorie died. The paper was fragile now, edges curled from time. He unfolded it slowly, reverently. Her handwriting filled the page, shaky but legible. Graham, it began. If you ever find my Lena, my baby sister, please love her. Love her like you love me. She was taken from me too soon, and I never forgave myself for not holding tighter. But if by some grace she finds you, let her stay. Let her be more than what I could be, a mother to Thomas, a light to you. Let her feel home, because if she returns, it means I am not truly gone. He sat for a long while, the letter open in his lap, one hand pressed to the page as though he could feel her voice through the ink. And suddenly, the truth settled around him undeniable. The woman who had arrived in a rattling wagon, with dust on her shoes and quiet sorrow in her eyes. She wasn't just a stranger. She was a promise returned, a wish fulfilled. And he hadn't seen it, not until now. Rising slowly, he walked back down the hallway. The nursery door was ajar. The lamplight inside had dimmed. Lena sat by the window, Thomas asleep on her shoulder, her eyes turned out to the dark sky beyond the glass. She looked peaceful but worn, as if some part of her had been carrying weight for so long, and only here had it finally dared to rest. Graham stood in the doorway, letter still in hand. His eyes drifted over the soft lines of her face, the quiet strength in her posture, the flicker of light against the tired set of her shoulders. He thought of Marjorie, her laughter, her way of humming to the kettle, the fragile way she had held his hand in those last days and whispered, "Find someone who can give him the kind of love I'm running out of." And now that someone was here. Lena turned slightly, sensing him there, but did not speak. Neither did he. Instead, he stepped forward and laid the letter gently on the table beside her. Their eyes met. She looked down at the page, her breath catching in her chest as she recognized a familiar script. She reached for it, fingers trembling. As she unfolded the letter, the room held still, wrapped in a silence that felt sacred. Her eyes moved across the words once. Then again, her lips parting without sound. Tears filled her lashes. She pressed the letter to her chest, as though it were a heartbeat restored. Graham didn't speak, didn't step closer. His voice came from the threshold, low and rough from too many things unsaid. She wrote it the day before she passed. Lena nodded, barely. Her whole body trembled like a breath about to break. Graham lingered for just a second more, then turned away, leaving her with the letter, the sleeping child, and a name that had finally, at last, come full circle. Morning came, quiet as snowfall. Since the night Lena had read Marjorie's words, a wall had risen between her and Graham, not made of anger or mistrust, but something gentler and more solemn. Reverence, confusion, restraint. They moved around each other like memories in the same room, aware, tender, but unsure. They both knew now. Neither spoke of it. Lena moved more quietly through the house, her footsteps softer, her movements weighed with something she could not name. She stayed near the nursery, the kitchen, the garden. Her eyes lowered when Graham passed, and when they did rise, they carried an apology he wasn't ready to accept. Graham said little, less than before, but he did more. He fixed the back door when the wind made it groan. He left kindling stacked by the hearth without being asked. He moved the rocking chair closer to the fire and draped a blanket over the back before the nights grew too cold. When Lena coughed one morning feeding Thomas, a tin of wild mint appeared on the counter by noon. When she cooked stew, he cleaned the dishes before she could reach them. They moved in quiet orbit, two moons circling the same quiet sun, always close, never touching. Until one morning, Lena reached too quickly for the milk bottle. It slipped from her grasp, hit the floor with a sharp crack, and spilled across her skirt in a wide, cold splash. She froze, her hand midair, flustered and wide-eyed, as milk spread across the floor in her skirt in a pale splash. Her fingers trembled as she reached for a rag, but Graham was already there beside her, kneeling silently, as though he had appeared from the walls themselves. He lifted the bottle with quiet care, his touch gentle, and began to wipe the spill with an old cloth, faded blue plaid with frayed corners. Lena recognized it instantly. It had been Marjorie's. Her breath caught, and her gaze shifted him in a moment, so soft it almost didn't happen. He looked up briefly, his voice low, weighted with something fragile. It was hers, but she wouldn't mind now. The words hung between them, quiet as the mist over morning fields. Lena looked into his eyes, not long, just enough to feel the ache of everything left unsaid. Her lips parted, but no words came, only a faint flush warming her cheeks as she accepted the bottle from his hand. "Thank you," she whispered, barely above a breath. He nodded, rose, and left the room without another word. That night, long after Thomas had drifted into sleep, Lena stood alone in the nursery, bathed in the hush of flickering firelight and the scent of pine. She held Marjorie's letter again, not to read it, just to feel it against her skin, as though the words had seeped into her bones. Each line echoed in her thoughts, more impossible and more sacred with every day she stayed. She had come here for a roof and work. She had found a child's arms around her neck, a man watching her like she mattered, a family that was hers before she knew. But how could she cross the line between sister and something more? Could she betray the memory of Marjorie by wanting what her heart had begun to crave? Her mind warned no. Her heart whispered yes. Across the hall, Graham stood by the window in the sitting room. The stars above blurred in streaks of silver beyond the glass. He could hear her soft movements in the nursery, the same gentle rhythm Marjorie had once walked with. But this was not her echo. This was Lena. This was the woman who sang lullabies without words, who made stew without being asked, who stitched herself into quiet corners of his life until he couldn't remember them without her. Still, he didn't cross the hall. Not yet. Love had begun to bloom quietly, like wildflowers after a burn, rooted in sorrow, reaching carefully toward light. And neither of them dared to speak it aloud, afraid it might break the fragile peace that had grown between them. Then came the harvest. The wheat ripened early that year, and the whole town bent itself into the fields. Lena offered to help, her sleeves rolled, her hands steady, determined to earn her place. The day was hot, the clouds pregnant with the weight of coming rain. Sweat ran in thin rivers down her back, and the ground beneath the hay turned slick. She worked carefully, always with caution, but the land was uneven. She didn't see the stone. Her foot caught. The fall came fast and hard. Her ankle twisted beneath her with a crack that stole her breath. She cried out once, then silence swallowed her. Rain came not long after, steady and gray, soaking her skirt, her hair, her skin. She tried to sit up, teeth clenched against the pain, but the world spun. No one heard, not until Mrs. Haverly, wringing her hands on Graham's porch, said she'd seen Lena heading toward the north field. She was pushing too hard, the old woman said. Something didn't sit right. That was all Graham needed. He saddled his horse in silence, his jaw tight. By the time he reached the fields, the rain had deepened into a curtain, draping the hills in shades of ash and ochre. He searched, heart-pounding. And then he saw her, a flash of fabric, a still shape at the slope's edge, curled slightly, one hand clutched to her ankle, the other shielding her face from the downpour. "Lena!" he shouted, his voice cutting the storm as he leapt from a horse. She tried to lift her head, her voice weak but defiant. "I'm fine." "You are not," he said as he knelt beside her, scooping her up without hesitation. She was soaked through, her breath trembling, her pain thinly veiled. "Graham," she murmured, trying to protest, but he hushed her, holding her close as thunder rolled across the hills. She leaned into him, not because of the pain, but because it felt like shelter. At the ranch gate, Mrs. Haverly stood with an oil lamp, its light flickering against the wind. She watched them approach and smiled sadly. "If Marjorie could see this," she said softly, "she would be proud. Love isn't betrayal. It's continuation." Graham didn't speak. He nodded, then carried Lena inside, laying her gently on the settee near the fire. He wrapped her in blankets, his hand steady even though his chest ached with fear. Her ankle had begun to swell, and he removed her boot with careful fingers, as though touching something sacred. She drifted in and out of sleep, her skin fever-warm, lashes fluttering. He stayed beside her, tending the fire, changing the cloth on her brow, never once leaving the room. At one point, as the first edges of dawn touched the sky, her eyes opened. She looked at him, really looked. "You stayed," she whispered. "And I'll never leave," he answered, his voice thick with truth. Her hand found his and held it, not in need, but in choice. It was the first time they touched with intent, not accident. No silence could undo that moment. No history could erase it. It was a truth older than either of them, quiet and complete. When she drifted back into sleep, her breathing easier now, Graham leaned back and watched the firelight dance across her face. He thought of Marjorie, not as a shadow this time, but as a bridge between what was lost and what had been found. He had loved once, and now he realized he could love again, not in spite of what came before, but because of it. By morning, the rain had stopped, but something deeper had begun, and as the afternoon sun spilled gold across the floorboards, Graham Lorne knew this house, at last, was no longer just a memory. It was a home,